Welcome viewers. Today's session is on a topic which is germane to the course Growth and Development, course MEC 004 of the MA Economics program. What we propose to do in this course or in this session is that we take a certain range of models. The topic you have already read on your screen. It is called the Lewis model and its extensions. So what I propose to do in this session today is we look at the Lewis model and the various extensions and different models emanating from this particular one that have been propounded or suggested, and see how far they are applicable to developing nations. But before coming to the Lewis model, let me try and look at some of the characteristics of developing societies on which the Lewis model is actually based. Now, one of the basic observations that experts have seen about developing nations, and this was true primarily in the 1940s and 1950s, and that was because in the 1940s and 1950s, many developing nations, including India, achieved their independence, and they were engaged on the task of nation building, which included economic development. And there was a lot of thinking going around in the world, not only in the developing nations, but also in developed nations by economists, social planners, policymakers on advice and suggestions about how to frame policies and strategies for optimal development in developing nations. Now, one of the ideas that gained currency around that time, and that was in fact quite prevalent, was that since the situation of developing nations, the characteristics of developing nations, by the way, at that time the phrase developing nations was not so popular as it is now. It was not politically it was not considered politically incorrect to give some other phrase. So at that time, the phrases that were in use were actually the poor countries or the less developed countries or the backward nations. Now we don't use these phrases, we say developing nations, but at that time those phrases were in operation. So what experts, including economists, thought and observed was that there were certain characteristics which prevailed in developing nations, which made the application of standard economic theory slightly problematic for these countries. According to them, standard economic theory which operated in the Western countries, which were applicable for the Western countries, would lose their relevance for the developing nations. And one of the characteristics that people saw in developing nations was what is called the vicious cycle of poverty. Now, the fact that these countries are less developed countries or developing nations is given by the fact that their per capita income, which is income per head, average income per head of each individual in these countries, is of a very, very low magnitude as compared to the per capita income of the developed nations. That itself makes these countries poorer. But within these countries, there is a gross inequality of in distribution of income, of property, of resources, even of consumption, which, as you would appreciate, makes clear that not only is the per capita income low, but if there is inequality within these countries, so there may be people, a large section of the people, who have abysmally low incomes and standards of living. Because in these countries there were also very rich people. There were capitalist classes which owned property. There were people who owned resources, and therefore they had higher incomes. And even with people who have such high incomes, and India did have some industrialization since the 19th century onwards, so even with some industrialization, some entrepreneurs, some high incomes, if the per capita income is low, then the incomes of a large section of people must be very low. Indeed, a huge section of the people in these countries are in absolute sense poor. Now, the reason why poverty persists in these countries was felt to be what is called what was given the name of vicious cycle of poverty. The reason was that In these countries, because of large number of people and because of low productivity, once the productivity is low, that generates very low incomes, particularly in agriculture. And a large section of the people in these countries, unlike the West, are engaged in agriculture. So if a huge section of the population or large proportion of the population is engaged in agriculture, where the productivity would be low, then the incomes that would be generated from those activities would itself be very low. Now, from these low incomes, naturally the amount that can be saved would be lower still, because people have a certain subsistence level of consumption, certain basic needs have to be met. Now, if the incomes is low, a large section of that income goes for consumption purposes, and therefore the savings in these economies are very, very low. Now, once the savings are low, then the channels to transform these savings into investments, and by investment I do not mean investment into financial sector for individual gains. By investment in economics in a macroeconomic sense, as you know, means addition to the real stock of capital, to machines, to physical infrastructure, to capital goods. Now, these have to be produced through investments in them, and these investments come from saving by the people. Now, if the incomes are low, then the savings are low. The savings are low implies the investments are low, and the investments are low, which implies in turn that the capital formation, by capital again I don't mean financial capital or money, but the stock of real physical capital, again like buildings, machines which can create more machines or more consumption goods, all these things, the total stock of national capital or national wealth would be very low. Now, again, when we have low capital and low stock of physical resources, your income in the next cycle again becomes low, because the capacity to produce is low. The cycle continues. Low income implies low saving implies low investment implies low capital formation in turn implies again low income. So this cycle continues, and according to people it has continued for a long time, and the policy makers and theoretical economists were seized with this problem, and they tried to suggest ways through which this vicious cycle could be broken. Many theories were suggested, and one of the theories that was suggested was by an economist from Trinidad, W. Arthur Lewis. He was later knighted, so he came to be known as Sir William Arthur Lewis, and he also later received a Nobel Prize in economics. Now, Lewis based his model not only on the need to break the vicious cycle of poverty, but he also based his model, the structure of his model, on a characteristic of the developing nations which he thought was basic. And that characteristic was, and this particular characteristic is common, the description of this characteristic is common to all the models that we will discuss in due course in this session today, and therefore these models collectively have come to be known as dualistic model. And what is the characteristic? The characteristic is that in developing nations, unlike developed nations, there are actually two sectors of the economy broadly. So therefore these are called dual sector models or dualistic models. And what are the two sectors? Broadly, you can say these sectors are agricultural sectors and the industrial sectors. At the time when Lewis was propounding his model, and others were in the 1950s, the services sector was not as advanced or did not occupy such a large section of the economy as it does today in early 21st century. So about 50 years back, it was a very, very small sector. So for all practical purposes, the economy was considered to have two broad sectors, agricultural sector and industrial sector. And it is also a fact that because of the experiences during Second World War and because of the experiences of being a colonized economy for more than 200 years, the Indian policymakers and planners immediately after independence were rather skeptical of engaging in foreign trade. So at that time, the phrase self-reliance actually meant what Nehru put a lot of faith in. It was called import substitution. So the idea was that we should make most of the goods ourselves and not depend or rely too much on foreign trade, on importing raw materials, and certainly not consumer goods. for basic consumption, and as it is, the policymakers frowned upon a consumerist society. So consumption was sought to be curtailed, and consumption which was imported, fancy foreign goods to be imported, was looked down upon. So this is just an aside, just to show that another thing that prevailed at that time was that India engaged in very little foreign trade. So most of the models that were put forward at that time actually assumed a closed economy. Closed economy, as you know, in economics means a country which has no foreign trade. So for practical purposes, India was considered to have be a closed economy. So Lewis suggested a model where there were two sectors, agriculture and industry. The country did not engage in foreign trade. Given this situation, what could be done? Lewis then comes to the agriculture sector itself. Now, one of the features of the agriculture sector, according to Lewis and according to a lot of other people, was that there were too many people in the rural areas. Now, normally an entrepreneur or a capitalist, when he or she employs workers, would employ workers up to an optimal level, not more than that. But what happens in rural sectors in developing nations is, because most of the people own and operate family-owned farms. There are small peasants who have their own land. Sometimes they work for others, but among the places where they work are their own family farms. And if the families are large, then 10 people may be doing the work of 3 or 4 people. What can be produced by 3 or 4 farmers is actually done by employing, or they are being engaged in work of about 10 or 15 people in any farms. So what happens is the marginal productivity of each farmer, that is the productivity at the margin, for the productivity, the addition to production by each additional person is very, very negligible. It is close to zero. So this marginal product of workers in rural areas was considered to be close to zero, almost zero. This is what Lewis assumed. And this was given the name, not by Lewis but by other commentators as well, of there being disguised unemployment. That people are employed, they look employed, but there is actually unemployment because they are not doing anything productive. So this was given the name of disguised unemployment. When there is disguised unemployment, there is labor which is surplus. When this labor is surplus and this labor has a very, very low productivity and is doing nothing to add to production, then this labor actually can be moved away from rural areas. This is what Lewis suggested. According to Lewis, the urban sector is where the industries are based. The industrial sector is where the wages are high, which is more capital intensive, and if the workers from the rural sectors can be transferred, the surplus workers from the rural areas from agriculture can be transferred to the urban industrial sector, that could give a fillip to the growth process. So according to Lewis, growth in the economy is actually created by the industrial sector. The industrial sector depends on, or rather can absorb, a lot of the surplus labor which exists in agriculture. Now, even if the industrial sector has to pay wages which is higher than the wages in the rural areas, which would be close to zero, then even by paying wages higher than the agriculture sector, this wage itself can be somewhat low, but high enough for the workers to attract them here, but low enough for the capitalists to generate profit for the capitalists. It is not a big dent on the budget of the capitalists to pay out wages to the workers. So what happens is, workers get absorbed. Here the surplus worker from agriculture can be transferred to the industrial sector. These workers can generate a lot of production in the industrial sector. This production, when say for instance it is sold in the market, it generates revenues for the company and revenues for the entrepreneurs, the capitalists. They pay out wages and other costs, raw material costs and other costs of production, including the wages. They are still left over with a huge surplus. Part of that surplus, according to Lewis, and this is the crux of the Lewis model, once this surplus is created in the industrial sector, which is not possible in the rural sector, this surplus is reinvested. Part of this surplus is reinvested. by reinvestment is meant, in the next round more workers are absorbed, in the next round more machinery is created, the scale of production expands, and within the industrial sector there is a lot of buying and selling from each other. One capitalist buys a certain commodity from another capitalist, certain goods are produced together. For instance, take the case of pen industry. If you have a fountain pen industry, and if the production of pen increases, if the demand for pen increases, then you can be certain that the production of ink would also increase. Once the production of ink means for ink to go in it, you have to produce glass bottles, so maybe the production of glass increases. So there are linkages in the economy, there are spillovers in the economy. So this, according to Lewis, it sounds absurdly simple, and when you look at this model, the thought might come to you, why didn't it occur to anybody? But the fact is, even if it did occur to somebody, Lewis was the first to formalize this kind of a dualistic system and suggest a structured and a theoretical model which actually goes some way towards suggesting how to break the vicious cycle of poverty. Now, according to Lewis, once these workers, there can be extensions. You might say the workers earn more and more income, they send part of that income to their homes in the village, the family members in the villages, the village economy income grows. Much like workers when they go out of India, poorer workers when they go out of India, they earn higher incomes abroad and they send remittances. So the economy through those remittances grows, and that income helps people to buy more products and thereby increase consumption standard of living. We have seen this kind of thing happen in developing countries. The remittances have played a large part in the development of Kerala, for instance, the last 20 years, or even of Pakistan. So there can be extensions to the Lewis model on this line of remittances. But let us first, before going on to other extensions, let us first come to what can be the criticisms of the Lewis model, and what have been suggested as criticisms of the Lewis model. One of the criticisms that have been suggested is that the model is somewhat unrealistic, in the sense that it just sort of assumes a smooth transition. Once there is the possibility of employment of this surplus labor, the idea is that people know that there is this where to go, and workers can simply be plucked out of the agriculture and put into the industry. The process is not so smooth. There are constraints. Somebody in interior Bihar may not be aware of the possibility of there being employment opportunities in that industrial sector, say in Bhiwandi in Maharashtra. There are the informational constraints, there are mobility problems, there are lots of problems. So that is one aspect, that the process may not be smooth. The second can be that there may be, and in fact there have been extensions of this model. What happens, people say, is once the first round of workers get absorbed in certain industries in the industrial area or the industrial sector, they might form quickly a trade union. Once they form a trade union or trade unions often prevent the employment of new workers who are not part of the union, or they want wages of the existing members of the union to be raised rather than new workers to be employed, and there is always an insider-outsider dichotomy in when trade unions operate. Or it might be possible that the profits may not come about so much. It may be possible that surpluses may not be generated due to recession in the economy, or so for whatever reason. So there may be factors that put a spanner in the working of the Lewis model. Now, there have been many extensions, many suggestions have been given, many criticisms have been made. But the basic dualistic structure that Lewis provided, not only as a vague descriptive idea, but that actually theoretically worked out fully functioning model of the economy, as he saw, what he saw as describing, and also as a policy strategy which could be applicable for the developing nations. And that is why Lewis model occupies such a seminal such a seminal model and occupies a center stage in developing economics today, even today. Now, just as Lewis gave a model, social scientists who were not always economists were looking at developing nations, developing societies, sociologists, social anthropologists and others, and they in turn, many of them came to the more or less the same conclusion as Lewis. But their suggestions was different, their description of the situation was different. And one such model was by an anthropologist called Beke. Now, Beke looked at the East Indies, the society around Indonesia and other countries, and he also looked at some of the other developing nations, and he came to the conclusion that there is what he termed social dualism in the developing nations. By social dualism, Beke meant that not only are techniques of production different, but the way society is organized is very different in the rural areas as compared to the urban areas or the modern areas. A sociologist would give a phrase like a modern sector and a backward sector, primitive sector. Now, according to Beke, what happened in the rural areas, according to him, what was important was not so much the fact that there is surplus labor in the rural areas, but the fact that socially and culturally people are oriented in a very different way. According to Beke, in rural areas, people in rural areas in developing nations are conditioned by the fact that they have, because they have enjoyed very poor standard of living, so that they have internalized and they actually frown upon having very high incomes. According to Beke, they are very satisfied with just a certain amount. If they can eat well, if they can live a decent standard of living, satisfied with. And unlike a business firm which wants to make as much profits as possible and go on or to have as much share of the market, a business company's objective might not just be to make profits, but to corner a large share of the market, to drive the competitors out of the market. Now that kind of, or a person in urban areas will be, according to Beke, more acquisitive. He or she wants to acquire more and more consumption goods, gain more. This sort of practice, according to Beke, was absent in rural areas. Now this meant another thing. According to Beke, this meant that people do not want too many assets, people do not want too much money, and they do not want to, according to him, they even work hard beyond a point. Like supposing a worker works 8 hours in a day and he gets a certain amount of income. Now, even if he gets more income by working 10 or 12 hours a day, beyond a point he will not work. He will say, this is enough for me. He will just sit back and relax. According to Beke, all these factors were giving rise to the situation where the rural sector was actually staying poorer. And that is because of the psychological or the cultural orientation of the people. And again, according to him, if somehow these people could be transferred, like Lewis, he suggested that if these people can be transferred from the rural sector to the urban sector, that would again push the growth process, not only because the urban sector is in itself more productive, but also because once they come here, the orientation of the workers will get changed. They will be more they will be sucked into the modern sector, and their entire thinking will be turned and tuned by the modern process, by which they would want to have as much money or as much improved a standard of living as possible. Now this is a very simplistic model which many people criticize, because many people say there is no empirical basis that the poor in the rural areas, the people in rural areas do not want to have income beyond a point, because there is tremendous inequality within the rural areas itself. Traditionally, there have been nobility in the rural areas, there have been upper castes in the rural areas, or dominant castes which have had a lot of income. There have been situations even in India and in other developed countries where there has been a tremendous inequality in income within the rural areas. So to say that nobody in rural areas wants to have more money or go beyond a certain standard of living is not true. What may be true is what people say is that the paradigm of economics that operates in the rural areas sometimes may be different from the paradigm of the exchange process, which is the linchpin of the capitalist system. The exchange where people exchange with each other, or what Adam Smith called the propensity of people to truck, barter and exchange for mutual benefit, that may be absent in the rural areas, and there may be taking place what anthropologists say a customary system of rewards and obligation. An example of which is the judgmani system in India, where certain castes interact with each other. There is a task of certain people to do certain activities, the task of other people to do other activities, and they do this not as a mutual benefit, but they have been doing this, and through this some mutual benefit arises, but it's a very different from a capitalist economy interaction. So people have criticized this on empirical grounds. Economists have always criticized, and most economists believe in the assumption of rationality, and according to which economic agents in the society, like consumers or workers or farmers or entrepreneurs, whoever it is, everybody wants to do the best that they can given the constraints. A consumer would want to have as much utility from the goods he or she consumes. That is what the economists say. A profit maker, a business person wants to make as much profits as possible. So why should somebody suddenly curtail their wants unless somebody is a saint or the sage? And there is no theoretical justification for that. That is the basic grounds on which the models of Bekke have been criticized. Now we go next to a very small extension of the Lewis model, and this is by Higgins, Benjamin Higgins. What Higgins did, as has been done by many people, they have taken one aspect of the Lewis model and highlighted on that, or looked at some limitation. They have accepted, all of these models accept the dualistic structure that Lewis propounded, but say, well, the Lewis model lacks this. Well, the Lewis model looks at all these things, but being a model is after all a simplification of reality. It looks at, it is too simplified a picture, looks at this aspect but doesn't actually highlight this other aspect. On these grounds, Benjamin Higgins said, well, Lewis talked of labor surplus situation in the agricultural sector. He talked of labor being absorbed in the rural sector, but what Lewis should have highlighted, or what can be added to the Lewis model, is that there is technological dualism. By technological dualism, what Higgins meant was, and what you know in economics, is what is called a production function. What is a production function? A production function is simply a technological relationship that suggests how inputs, that is the factors of production, how they get transformed into outputs. In what combination are these taking place? I mean, in what proportions are inputs being combined? Can you have, supposing you have a fixed amount of labor, with that amount of labor can you vary the amount of capital to get the same amount of output, or does it use too much capital and very few labor? Can you increase labor and decrease capital? Can you increase capital and decrease labor? So according to Higgins, the basic feature of developing nations is that in rural areas, the production function is a very flexible production function, in the sense that factors can be varied. One factor can be increased, one factor can be decreased, maybe perhaps with the exception of land. Land may be fixed, and there may be constraints to the buying and selling of land. So the amount of land that each rural capitalist farmer or rural family farm has may be fixed. But within that, the implements on the one side, the labor on the other side, the tractors or whatever, that can be varied to some extent according to Higgins. But the feature that prevails in the urban sector, the factory sector, is that in modern factory sector, the production function is of a fixed coefficient type, which means if you have 10 laborers and you have 2 machines to work with them, the technology is such that it has to be like that. You cannot make it 6 machines with these 10 laborers, or you can't make with these 2 laborers or only 2 machines, only 4 laborers. Then the machine will not be working optimally, and the workers will be overworked and will not be able to deliver the goods optimally. So according to Higgins, the very fact that there are fixed factors of production in the urban sector makes it difficult for smooth employment of workers, even if workers were to be released from the rural sector. So what would happen according to Higgins was that the rural sector may have, because of the flexible nature of the production function, maybe you can increase some capital implements, maybe you increase the number of hoe, you buy more bullocks or ox to tend your farms, and you can release some of the workers. But unfortunately, because of the production function nature of the urban sector, these workers may not always be optimally absorbed in the urban sector. According to Higgins, supposing a production process is such that it requires, say, 3 machines and 10 workers. Now, unless the capitalist doubles his scale of production and makes it 6 machines and 20 workers, the additional 10 people who will be coming from the rural areas might not find productive employment. So, although there is dualism, according to Higgins, just like in the Lewis model, the process is not as smooth as Lewis would suggest. This is a brief extension of the Lewis model by Higgins. A similar extension of Lewis was given by 2 economists, Gustav Ranis and John Fay. Fay-Ranis model has come to be known as the closest extension of the Lewis model because it is exactly like the Lewis model, but there is one fundamental difference. According to Lewis, the engine of growth is the modern sector. As you just heard, what Lewis was talking about was that there is surplus labor in the in the agricultural sector. There is excess labor in the agricultural sector. There is disguised unemployment in the agricultural sector, and the marginal product of workers in the agricultural sector is very, very low. So, all these factors make it possible for this surplus labor to be released from the agricultural sector and to be brought into the urban, modern factory sector. According to Fay and Ranis, the process is just the opposite. It is not that the workers will come from the industry to agriculture, but according to Fay and Ranis, the dynamic sector of the developing nations is actually the agricultural sector. It is by not only producing food for the rest of the economy, and there being a large proportion of the people or the labor force engaged in agriculture, 75% to 80% in all countries of the people were engaged in agriculture at the time these models came by. But according to Fay and Ranis, it is the agricultural sector which would be generating the surplus in the economy, and that surplus somehow financially gets transformed, and that will actually be being the engine of growth, and that will finance the development of the factory sector. So, what happens is, according to Fay and Ranis, and they were perhaps a similar model was given by the Chinese policymakers in the 1950s and 60s during Mao Zedong's time after the Chinese Revolution. According to Mao, if there are what the Chinese model was given the name in the 50s of walking on 2 legs, which meant you should not rely too much on agriculture or you should not rely too much on industry. We'll have to develop both. But since theirs was a poor country with most of the people in agriculture, Mao Zedong said ways should be devised to prevent actually workers from going from agriculture to industry too much, and there should be productive employment for them in the agricultural sector. So, at that time the agriculture was collectivized and communes were formed, small communes were formed, which were the idea was that surplus would be created. Fay and Ranis have a similar model, except that they don't have a totalitarian society and they don't suggest a dictatorship which will forcibly create communes or collectivize agriculture. According to them, in due course of time, the way things operate in the developing nations, the agriculture sector would generate surplus, and that would finance the revenue, the growth of the industrial sector. How? Because once the incomes of the agricultural sector grows, they will be that sector will buy the products of the industrial sector. Now, if most of the people are engaged in agriculture, and if they don't have the incomes to buy goods of the industrial sector, then even if the industrial sector grows, how will they sell their product? Where is their revenue going to come from? Where is their surplus going to come from? That surplus is going to come from agriculture, and that can only come from agriculture if agriculture grows very high. Similar was the case in China. The Mao model suggested that the agricultural sector should be such that people the standard of living of the people increases. The Mao model is very similar to the Lewis model, except that it is a collectivized economy model. But the idea is that the standard of living of the agricultural sector should grow in order to generate surplus for the industrial sector in turn. But also, if the standard of living of 80% of the people grows, that means the country as a whole is growing. Now, it is another fact that in the Mao Zedong model, After from the mid 60s onwards, there took place what he called a cultural revolution, where not only were people in agriculture kept in agriculture, forcibly students or doctors or engineers and others from the industrial sector or modern sector or the urban areas, the cities, were forcibly sent to the villages to work. Now that culminated into a lot of problems, which we know from since 1978. China gave up that model and totally privatized their agriculture, and since then, of course, we have seen a spectacular growth in the Chinese economy. To come back to the Fay and Rennes model, Fay and Rennes, thus, as you would appreciate, turn the Lewis model on its head. What they say is that true, there are two sectors of the economy, but unlike Lewis, the dynamic sector is not the industrial sector. The dynamic sector is actually the agricultural sector, and it may not be true that the wages in agricultural sector may be close to zero, or because the government might enact a welfare measure which prevents the wages from falling below a certain level, so that the wages will also be high, and if the agricultural sector is productive, then it helps to generate or absorb the products of the industrial sector, and thereby making the industrial sector also grow. So all these models are actually describing the situation with regard to the growth process in the developing nations. All of them assume a rural sector which is primarily an agricultural sector, and they assume a industrial sector which is primarily an urban sector, but also explicitly in Higgins' model, but implicitly in other models, the techniques of production according to all these models in agricultural sector is somewhat backward or primitive. The techniques of production in the industrial sector are more modern, which means in the agricultural sector itself, most of the agriculture, say in India, look at the 1950s, which is the time when the Green Revolution also had not taken place. Within techniques that are applicable for agriculture all across the world, in agriculture in India, people were still using oxen and other animals, draft animals for agriculture. Tractors, harvester threshers and modern machinery was really absent in most of India for agriculture. Now, I am not comparing agriculture versus industry. What I am saying is, within agriculture, as compared to agriculture elsewhere, the techniques of production in agriculture were really actually backward. Whereas in industrial area, from the mid 19th century in India, apart from the industries like iron and steel, the Tatas had started modern iron and steel. There was the jute industry. There was the cotton textile industry, and there were some industries which the cotton textile industry in India, for instance, used techniques which was the same as the techniques used for the cotton textile industry used in the United States at that time. In fact, because of the Civil War in America, because of the disruption of the supply of cotton, there was some effect on the cotton production in India in the 19th century and the 18th century. But the fact remains that industry, as compared to industry elsewhere in the world, was almost at a par in terms of technique. But agriculture, as compared to agriculture elsewhere in the world, was really backward. So this fact was captured and made a central feature in almost all the models. Higgins put it at the center stage, this technological dualism. Others underplayed it, but implicitly it is present in all the models. In fact, Becquet added a different dimension. He added the dimension that, as compared to the modern sector, the traditional sector, the rural sector, the agricultural sector, call it what you will, is just composed of people who have a different orientation, mental and cultural orientation. They don't want to work too hard because they just don't want to. It's not that they can't work hard or they're lazy. That is the way things are. They don't want to make too much money. They would much rather have speculative activities rather than actual scientific investment profit making activities. So everybody highlighted some a particular aspect, but there were some common features. Now finally, we come to, as a final model, we come to a model which talks of not just within this dualistic structure, not just the growth process, of the economy as a whole, but actually looks at the process from the point of view of the worker, say a worker who is in agriculture and who would like to go to industry. The question that this model asks is, why should a worker go from agriculture to rural sector, and if he does or if she does, what are the factors that induce him or her to do so? This model is called the Harris-Todaro model, after the two economists who jointly propounded this model, Harris and Todaro. Their model is actually a model not so much about the growth of the economy, but a model of the migration of workers from rural to urban areas. And this is a very common fact that we see in India, for instance. Over the decades, we have seen the problem of people migrating from rural areas to urban areas. According to Harris and Todaro, the main decision making of the workers is guided by the expected wage differential in the industrial and urban rural sectors. Industrial sectors, not only are the wages more, but the workers expect, even if they don't know how much the wages are more by, they just expect that the wages are more, and therefore they migrate. Now, since there is an expectation element, and this is crucial, this means sometimes workers work on the probability of there being higher wages. Workers sometimes might come more than the optimal amount. So what is the effect? According to Harris and Todaro, there is expected wage differentials in the two sectors. There is actual wage differentials, but it is the expected wage differential which pushes workers from the agriculture or the backward sector to the modern industrial sector. But since more workers can sometimes come, there might take place tremendous unemployment, and there might be other social problems might be created, like you see in urban areas in India, like slums and poor living conditions. What might also take place, and what does actually take place, and this is what Harris and Todaro suggest, is the creation of what is called an urban informal sector, where maybe a small boy from the village works as a cleaner in a garage. He cleans cars and does small odd jobs. He works in a small dhaba and delivers the tea. He is not absorbed in the rural sector, in the modern sector. So he is neither in the agricultural sector which he has left, nor is he in the modern industrial sector. There gets created an informal sector. So what happens over time is there is a financial dualism also which takes place, because the way wages are paid, where the way accounts are kept is very different, not only in the urban and rural sector, between the modern and backward sector, but within the urban areas there is an organized sector and there is an unorganized sector. So you see the implications of the Harris-Todaro model on migration is that there may be while workers can be absorbed, as Lewis has suggested, we come to another end of the story by Harris and Todaro, where there may be excess labor in the urban areas. What started as excess labor in the rural areas, which can be sent to the urban areas, now gets transformed in the Harris-Todaro model as there being unemployment in the urban areas, informal sector being created in the urban areas, social problems like slums and crime in the urban areas. So these are various spin-offs. So to conclude, we might say that there is a whole class of models which has existed from the 1950s till today, which focus on the dualistic structure of the developing nations, because empirically again dualistic structures do happen to be a fact. And it is also a fact that workers can be transformed or can be transferred, and as does happen. So what started in Lewis as a prescriptive suggestion where workers should be sent from the rural to urban areas takes place by the time we come to Harris-Todaro as creating potential problems by there being more workers who come from the rural areas and who cannot be absorbed in the urban areas, who come here because of the expected wage differentials, but face unemployment and face the prospect of getting into the informal. So if you have any suggestions or any questions that you have or that gets arisen in your mind, you can always write to us at the faculty at Indira Gandhi Open University, Faculty of Economics, School of Social Sciences. We would always welcome your suggestion.